I'd like to welcome everybody this afternoon to the session that we've got on how to modernise your security operations for cloud and digital transformation in 2022. So I'll just dip onto the next slide. And I suppose I should start really is why we've arranged the event and probably the reasons why that customers now are struggling to find how they're going to modernise as they start to transform and move into cloud and digital technologies, and how that landscape changes. And obviously the threat landscape also changed significantly, which is why Ben's on the presentation as well, to go through some of the things that are happening in that stage as well. So we've done it because customer requests really to say, no, we need some help, we need some guidance, and we're taking customers on that journey at the moment. So this is the reason we've set this event up. So quick through the agenda. So the introductions we'll go through, then we'll hand over to Ben to do his slides. So we'll get him to present his piece. Then we'll go through the top 10 security best practices to do with cloud and how we should be preparing our infrastructure for security and posture protection. Obviously, we'll go into some zero trust principles as well. And then we'll move into modern use case management and the SOC, which we'll be handing over to Stephen Crow for that piece. And then towards the end, we'll do a bit of a closing up session and take you through some of the things that we think we can do to help you on the journey as and when you see fit. No, the top 10 security best practices that you should be considering. Most people will have deployed this in some kind of sense, but as we start to move into cloud and making best use of the tooling that within cloud and digital, they need to make sure that we can start to use the automation orchestration capabilities within those platforms to be able to do that. So I'll quickly go through this. I'll follow this then by zero trust, which I think again is probably a hot topic with what Ben's just discussed, because obviously identity is probably the center of all that from a policy perspective. So making sure that we lock down the way that we access and consume assets and applications, irrespective of where they reside, or whether they reside in a SaaS service or a PaaS or an IaaS service in cloud, or even on-prem for that matter. So I'll go through quickly these points. So again, fairly high level, and these points here, when we talk about security, hygiene and visibility, we know that the majority of the customers that we speak to will have a good security, hygiene and visibility policy, and the way that they drive it, and the way that they actually do this using probably legacy ways of actually managing hygiene. They're probably not really using the tools. But also when you think about cloud, you think about digital, the number of services and features that change, and how quickly they change, to keep security, hygiene and visibility up to date without using any form of autonomous screening and scanning is going to be extremely difficult. So this point here, what we're trying to get to is use the tools that are available to you in cloud. If you're in Azure, for instance, and you've got things like Security Center, or Defender for Cloud is now Security Center, will have all these tools available to you, and it will be able to scan and give you real-time security posture and making sure that your hygiene is there. Then obviously what you need to do then is making sure the people that actually own the resources to which the platform is screening will need to take ownership and responsibility of those particular resources, whether it's an application, a service. They need to make sure that those guys take responsibility for that, making sure that the hygiene is right for that particular application or service, and making sure you've got visibility, and obviously how you remediate and having the necessary processes in place to do that is obviously very, very important to make sure you can stay from a hardened perspective, that service and that application or resource is protected from any kind of compromise from a security perspective. Passwordless and MFA for admins. I think this is just not for admins. I think this is for pretty much every employee. As we start to shift, passwords are obviously, as you can just see from what Ben has just showed you there, people trying to main passwords in different systems, especially in social engineers, will tend to repeat. Yes, we can make passwords really illegible, but obviously most people, if they need to remember a password, will make it in a way that they can probably repeat it on multiple systems, and that includes systems that hit in the corporate. So password policies are really massively important to businesses and infrastructure. You know, whether it's a service principle or it's another identity, you need to make sure that these passwords are actually are really, really strong. Or you move to modern ways of doing this by using passwordless. So using biometrics, using a thing that you own, a thing that you are, and the thing that you can remember. So these things from MFA, we need to make sure that we can use these tools to make sure that these can't be compromised through some form of identity theft, which will allow, especially for admins, where admins will probably allow you to laterally move through the infrastructure and application resources. So ensuring that, yes, for admins certainly is, but I think for every employee that sits within the business and partners and probably guests and any customers that are associated to that particular business will need to go through exactly the same mechanisms, which I think is heavily important. So we start looking at segmentation and zero trust enablement. So zero trust has been, it's been bounded around quite a bit, and I think most people on the call would have heard zero trust in some way or form, or probably already on that journey, because it's not a button or a radio button that you can switch on in Azure or on-prem that will switch zero trust on. It's a series of them. In the next set of principles after these 10, we'll go through things that you should be looking at from a zero trust perspective, but also making sure you segment. And segment is massively important when you've got legacy applications where the legacy protocols are not as secure and are easy to be compromised. You need to segment them off. Business critical applications need to be segmented off, and then maybe extra controls put in place. But segmentation is obviously massively important, not just at the VLAN perspective, but as you move into cloud, looking at VNets, NSGs, all that type of mechanism that is used to segment your business critical assets within the business, which is generally going to be data or services that you actually provide to other users. So having that, and then putting zero trust, obviously segmentation is part of the zero trust framework and journey, ensuring that you make sure you have that policy in place and you're enabling it where you can and where you see fit. This one stands for itself. Advanced threat protection is massively important in all workloads, endpoints, and making sure that you pick a well-known brand. One that is, if you have any access to Gartner or have any of the market researchers, making sure you do your research on what ATPs are. There are some great ones out there. You can talk about the Kaspersky's and Trend Micro, Sophos. But I think even looking in the Microsoft stack, you looking at the Microsoft Defender or Microsoft 365 Defender or Defender for Cloud. These are very important cloud-based functions that allow you to use all the automated remediation within the platforms, allowing you to be able to be more consistent, but also proactive in the way that you're managing threats through your environment. It also gives, from a visibility perspective, gives you where the attack posture is likely to look like. So you need to make sure you have enabled every single endpoint that can take it. If it's not, you have to probably apply it to the nearest probably network enabled point you can to make sure you can provide some kind of protection. DevOps is probably, as we've moved into cloud, DevOps is, obviously with the tooling that you can use within cloud and digital, DevOps is probably that area which is, yes, it should be segmented completely, but also securing the code that you're going to use for applications. And some of the data and applications that are stored within DevOps are generally going to be very similar to what your production data looks like. So you need to make sure you're securing that data, but also securing the access and the identity of people that access that. So you should still go through MFA, passwordless for those people accessing DevOps and the DevOps features within that environment. So that is pivotal to making sure you're not leaking some IP out of the code that you've got stored in a GitHub or any other repository that you use to manage your DevOps environments. Then we start to move into modernizing security operations. Now this we've spent a bit of time on. We spent a lot of time with Gartner understanding why we need to look at how we modernize this, because the tooling is certainly a lot different from legacy days of having a SIEM that will provide all the you'll point all your logs to the SIEM and expect to then obviously you'll get quite a few logs, you get a lot of noise, you'll get a lot of alerts, and you'll probably get that point where most of your SecOps analysts will just be overburdened with probably a lot of false positives and actually not being very effective. Yes, you'll probably catch some bits and bobs, but obviously this is where you want to start using some of the tooling within cloud to allow you to kind of react and be proactive in identifying alerts, incidents, and then driving automated remediation, which is obviously massively important to be able to keep, especially as we get as our landscape grows out into IaaS and PaaS and SaaS and even on-prem. Making sure you use an automation orchestration service to be able to manage this and managing your security operations significantly helps the SOC. So looking at things such as SOAR, a platform must be one, cloud-based, and you need to move to cloud-based SIEM and SOAR, because obviously it has all the relevant tooling. Because as you start to look at SOAR, it's more like data analytics. You've got to look at deep forensics. You need to look at things like KQL. So from a data querying perspective, making sure you've got the necessary skills to be able to do that threat hunting, or even identifying really complex threats that will come into the platform that you need to build playbooks for, notebooks for, runbooks for, so your SecOps team can really get the sophisticated kits under control as soon as possible, because these threats are getting more sophisticated as the tooling, because they use all the modern tooling that we should be using in our own environments. So they'll be using automation, orchestration, so you won't have a guy sat there not knocking these threats out. You'll have probably automation engines all over the world doing exactly the same thing, all being orchestrated from one person. So quite quickly, you've got to make sure that you can modernize using that modern tooling. Now this, for me, firewall strategy is networking and identity. For me, is that yes, firewalling is extremely important when you're segmenting traffic and you're protecting your applications, whether it's coming from the internet or coming from internally. You need to make sure that you're choosing the firewall for the right reasons. Generally, what we see, firewalling, if you've got resources that have got high experience in working with vendors like Palo Alto or Cisco or Fortinet, and you may want to still put this stuff in the cloud, of course you do, but also always consider looking at even the cloud native features as they start to become a lot more aligned with the other vendors. So from a native firewall perspective, even if you look at Azure Firewall Premium, that has all the same features as a Palo Alto does, or a Fortinet. But what it is, it's a PaaS service. So it sat on all the underlying infrastructures, all the hardening of the underlying infrastructure from an IaaS perspective is taken care of and secured, while you only really have to start looking at how. So you don't have to look at load balancing, you don't have to look at any complexities around that. That is all simplified through that firewall strategy. So make sure not only on premise, but also in cloud, looking at NSGs, looking at WAF, looking at all those firewalls, that strategy, how they all hang together, what they're likely to protect, where that segmentation is also aligned, making sure you can protect all your payload, all the workloads, and your users as best as possible. I've kind of touched upon this when we start looking at modernizing operations, but automate and orchestrate as much as possible. The tooling is there to be able to probably capture 80 to 90% of all incidents that come through a SIEM or a SOAR. And you need to make sure that you have the right team or the right partner that can go and build the necessary automation orchestration to protect the business and protect it 24/7, 365, and ensure that the actual incidents that do come through that automation and orchestration piece are ones that can be triaged by a proper person. So you're helping the SecOps team be able to manage incidents that are more than likely to be a real incident that can be triaged, and then that should then be pushed back in that from a reiteration perspective back into the DevOps team or the Sec DevOps team to be able to build the runbooks and the playbooks to mitigate those incidents in the future. Again, the tooling's there. Make sure you use the tooling. There's an abundance of tooling in Azure, in AWS as well. So making sure you use that tooling to the best. And obviously this requires different skill sets. And this is why we're speaking to customers now as they are transitioning into cloud, having the necessary skills or the appetite to be able to run the services 24/7, 365 is very difficult. But obviously we'd like to help customers go on that journey as they catch up, as they become more conversant in the necessary scripting skills they may need to build the playbooks and the runbooks to be able to support their own infrastructure. This one we see when we migrate in a lot of customers. So obviously some customers will do lifts and shifts, some customers will actually re-platform applications. But one thing you've got to think about in Azure or AWS for that matter is enabling platform protection for critical applications. And what I mean by that is switching on things like DDoS, switching off WAF, they've got application firewalling. That stuff needs to protect the front end for critical applications. Even if it is an application that is serving the business and it doesn't actually face the internet, you need to provide the proper platform protection to protect those applications. And again, that's not necessarily just from the traffic or from end users, but identity as well. People administering those critical applications as well is also massively important. But enable the features, whether it's native or it's via a third party, ensure that that infrastructure or that design is there to protect anything that is facing a user. Because obviously, as you've seen with what Ben's presented today, anybody can hijack an identity and still get into that application and probably cause some damage with regards to exfiltration of important or critical data, or even affecting service from a DDoS perspective. Then again, as we are moving on that journey, we've got to go back, we've got to retire legacy security solutions, legacy security protocols. These are the ones that generally will have the most exposure to attackers, and they will be able to get into the infrastructure via those legacy protocols. So if you're looking at things like AD and identity, using things like LDAP and some of the Kerberos, so they're all legacy protocols that should be retired as you move on that zero trust journey. But making sure you're mopping up and looking at the hygiene of when you are moving and migrating of all those legacy services that reside within your infrastructure. So these are probably the 10 principles. There's probably another 20 you can add to this, but these are ones that we see prominent. These ones that we're speaking to customers about all the time. And obviously there's some consideration for you guys to be able to go out and have a look at that. Just take a drink. So I've got 12 minutes now. So some of the principles. So the NCSC obviously published this. So some of the public sector guys will probably see some of the recommendations from the National Cybersecurity Centre. They will give you a lot of, although high level, some guidance on where you should be taking zero trust. So some of the principles that they've come out with is around knowing your architecture, your users, your devices, and your service and your data. Massively important for any of the team, any of the IT team and the security teams should know this stuff inside out. It's massively important, because how can you protect something if you don't know anything about it? So that's around probably capturing the assets or the inventory, all this stuff that resides in your infrastructure. Know the user, device and service identities, making sure that if we know that user and device will have identities, but making sure your service identities, which what applications use, make sure you know them, what they're used for, and why they're there. And also, if users are no longer in the environment, they need to be, obviously there must be a way of deleting these services and making sure they go through that process. And you should really look at automation to be able to do that. So we shouldn't rely on in Bob that sits in IT support to be removing these identities as and when they're no longer needed. It should be automated so you can keep a proactive and an efficient way of managing identities through the business. Assess user behavior, service and device health. So this is where monitoring is really important. So if you think about ATP, or even looking at AD and Azure AD, you can get a lot of this stuff from the likes of some of the SIEMs out there, but even some of the XDR propositions that are out there to support your business. So you can get UBA stuff, so that's user entity behavior and analytics, but also not just for users, but also services. When services are being used, where they're being used from, and obviously the device health. Using things like Intune or that, you can start to get really good understanding how that device health, where it's been, if there's been any compromise, making sure you can also understand what that behavior is like. So then starting to tie that into how you start looking at things such as a CASB. So how do you look at a cloud access brokering for applications that might be required for particular users and services? Use policies to authorize requests. So this is where zero trust is really strong. So you need to look at centralized services. So whether a user, a thing, a device, or an application requires to access certain services within the business, that centralized policy or access policy should be there for irrespective of what application, whether that application is on-prem, whether that is an application that sits within in a SaaS application, or IaaS and PaaS. So, and the reasons for that is then you start to move beyond the likes of VPN. So, because I don't really need it, because I've got all the necessary principles centrally. I only have to update them principles centrally once. So I'm very efficient the way that I control that. So these are things that you should be looking. So you're looking at centralized policy. So if you look at, I know I keep leaning back to Microsoft, but if you look at Microsoft and Azure AD, conditional access is one of those things that allow you to be able to do that, forcing people to either you know, if they don't meet the criteria to access a certain application, then they either have to re-authenticate through MFA or passwordless, or they have to request for access to a particular service. So obviously that a pivotal thing to do when you're talking about zero trust. Authenticated, authorized. I mean, it says every way, but I think everything that you do should be authenticated and authorized, irrespective. This is where MFA comes in. Yes, you might want to think that people don't want to do that, but if you're using passwordless and you're using like Hello for Windows, things like that, it becomes very easy then for users and applications to consume services with the right identity and the right productivity. Because last thing we want to do here is turn off that that productivity for whether they're guests, partners, users, you know, or employees for that matter. Focus the monitoring on you need to monitor this stuff, and you need to monitor it 24/7, 365. And obviously for me, ensuring that if there's been a compromise, whether that service is available and should be and should be active, whether it is a service that is pivotal to the business, so it's business critical, making sure that it's always going to be available for users. So whether that is out of hours, in hours, but if it's business critical, you need to be monitoring all the things that are supported for that particular service. So monitoring is obviously massively important. I think most people on the call have got some form of monitoring that they can use for their users, their devices, and their services. And then obviously don't trust your network, and that includes your own. So zero trust is all about authenticated, trust nobody, and prove explicitly that you have access into the business, but also go down to the lengths of actually looking at just-in-time access, just enough access to be able to manage, you know, the appropriateness of people consuming services from a particular identity. So that's massively important. And then when you are going out to the market to obviously look at zero trust, how are you going to deploy it? Make sure that the services you are procuring or implementing are designed for zero trust. So I think I've put some stuff in the resources, which is at the end of this part, that will give you some really good understanding about what where you want to go to look at some of the advice and guidance for zero trust and how you would adopt it. There's some of the journeys that you can take and some of the adoption and modernization techniques you can use to adopting zero trust. So bring this all together, a bit more visualization rather than going through the bullet points, kind of what we've just been through there, is generally what you've got is you've got a typical flat network. You know, you've got your managed corporate devices at the bottom there. You would access through some form of cloud, some of the cloud. So you've got some SaaS applications in there, and probably some, you know, some IaaS and PaaS services in Azure and AWS and Google. And obviously you'd manage them endpoints the way you would do. So we need to shift away from this typical flat network to provide that protection from a zero trust perspective. So we want to start to partition. So what are managed devices? How then managed devices access services? You know, whether that is going to be through managed internet, so obviously internally and managed core. Obviously you can start to build zero trust to give the right access to the right applications for those particular users, depending on what devices and how they've actually accessed those devices. We can start looking at you know, managed virtual desktop as well. And again, this is something that will be it's managed, but again, you've got all the core policies that can be done. So we need to make sure that we articulate what a managed virtual desktop can do versus what a managed device can do. So again, when we talked about accessing applications, because generally when you're using zero trust, accessing things like SaaS apps or Office 365, you know, Dynamics 365 and services like that, yes, it's all well and good, and we can do that, and we don't need to have any VPN set up. It's all secure because of the encryptions within the connection that you have to the service. However, what happens if I've got critical business servers that reside either on-prem, set in Azure? How do I access those services? Well, we want to start being able to publish applications that are being built by our application teams and then present them with actually not having to use a VPN. So we use the same centralized policy to be able to access them, whether they're on-prem, whether in SaaS, whether in IaaS or PaaS. And that's massively important for anybody managing identity for a business. That is the things that you need to be looking at. So again, where you've got some of the specialized segments, then things like IoT and OT, where you've got, you know, printers, it could be even building management, all that type of stuff is stuff that you need to be able to manage and firewall off and segment. But you just don't firewall and forget. You still have the other controls and mechanisms through identity to be able to manage those particular endpoints. Although they may not have the modern interfaces, they still need to have the right controls in place to be able to manage them and keep them secure from outside threats. So in essence, really, if you look at this, adaptive access control in the middle, you know, what are your differentiated identities? How do you strongly manage them? How do you just manage ones that are users and partners? And then also anonymous users and consumers. But how then do we manage access to sanctioned SaaS applications, unsanctioned and unmanaged stuff? So this is kind of a high-level view of what we've just been through, but it can get quite quickly illustrates how important that centralized control gives you to be able to manage access to different applications and services and users in a more effective and proactive way. So resources, again, I've put some in there. It saves you hunting around. Probably some of you have seen that. I'll make reference to the one at the bottom, which is quite good. If you go, that's a 60 slides. I know it's Microsoft reference, but they've got a good end-to-end proposition there that will show you how we certainly use this with our customers to go through how they should be adopting service, and it'll go into people security, it'll go into security operations, identity, hybrid. So they're the things that you want to look at. It's got a 60-slide presentation that you can go through with the notes on it. Will give you some really good understanding about, from a high-level perspective, what you should be concentrating on when you're looking at a reference architecture from a cybersecurity perspective. So I think that's me. So if I will stop presenting now and then hand that over if you want to request Stephen. Just stop sharing. So I hand over to Stephen Crow now, who'll just go through some more stuff about how we manage. So obviously, the overview about what the SOC does, the benefits of our SOC and what we've done, how we've built and how we've modernized it, and then go through a typical threat. So hopefully you'll get some guidance off there. So anything you need off me off the back of the webinar, please reach out. But I'll pass over to Steve now.
Thanks, Mark. Hi, I'm Stephen Crow. I am our Head of Security Compliance for ANS, and I manage our Security Operations Centre. So I'm going to give a bit of an overview of what that is, what we deliver through that centre, and how we use it to protect clients from ongoing threats, vulnerabilities, and 0 days. So just a bit of an overview about our Security Operations Centre. We're fully based in the UK, and all of our staff are security cleared, which is a high level of clearance that you're required to go through to work in the public sector. We all work on a 24/7, 365 sort of support rotation to make sure we're always there to continuously protect client infrastructure. We work clients continuously provide improvements to security. So as well as responding to threats, etc., we're constantly working with our client base to improve their posture and not just take it as a reactive service, but to be as proactive as possible to make sure we're moving the times. It's obviously a very fast-paced industry. The main purpose is what we do is so that clients can focus on their primary business function. Security takes up a lot of time, and it's a headache for people. They don't want to deal with it, and it's got a very good skill set in the house of how we prevent threats and provide that protective service for people. So this is really what an overview of our Security Operations Centre looks like. On the front lines, we deploy as much automation as possible to provide levels of protection and to block the concept sort of low-hanging fruit, a lot of automated attacks. Any alerts that come through are triaged by our first line, and then any incidents that need resolving always escalate up to a second line. Within our security operations, we have subject matter experts in different areas, as well as threat hunters. So the term threat hunting is used to describe, looking for indicators of compromise that are a low level that you might not usually expect. This is all managed by a Security Operations Centre manager on a 24/7 by 365 basis. One of the main elements of our Security Operations Centre is use case management, which is a term that is known in the industry to really make sure that we are building out services that are designed specifically for each client in their specific industry. As a process, we look at how we can identify use cases across a client's sort of risk posture. So for every business, they're going to have different threats. So there's ones that will face face every business, but some clients have threats that are specific to them. So the way that we understand what those threats are is we use a process of building out use cases for those clients. So through an agile sprint, what we'll do is work with clients, say, right, what is your biggest business risk in terms of from a security perspective? So for some clients it might be phishing, some clients might be more worried about ransomware, data exfiltration, etc. So listing out those threats and risks in order, we can then build a use case out to say, right, if this is your biggest worry, then what we need to do is implement data collectors and collect the correct type of logs to make sure that we are identifying where that threat is happening. I think one of the biggest problems you'll have from a security perspective is just noise in general. You can collect every log from every device everywhere, but unless you have a clear understanding of what you're trying to do and prevent, then that will get lost in all of the noise. So by understanding what you want to protect against, we can then make sure we're collecting that specific data set. So again, to use phishing example, what we'd want to do from there is connect into Exchange Services, Office 365, endpoints and users to collect data around what files are being executed, what files are being downloaded. And then from there, we can then put in controls to say, right, well, if we collect this data and we know it's to speak around specifically around what files are being downloaded, then we can create alerts off the back of that and also be proactive to say, well, if this user is downloading a file, maybe we should prevent that, or maybe this user shouldn't be able to download a file to this location. So we can put in a load of preventative measures to stop an attack happening, and also reactive measures to know if a user does download a file, for example, then we need to escalate it up the chain, generate an alert, notify X, Y, Z people, and then from there follow an incident response playbook to say lock out this user, lock out this device, etc. So we build up these use cases. They go through a life cycle, because a lot of the time things will get to a stage where that use case may have served its purpose, is no longer relevant, or you're not getting any use out of it. There might be false positives that are being generated, or you might not be getting hits for it. So what we'll do is revisit these on an ongoing basis to retire those use cases, and then reassess going forwards to find out new use cases. It might be 0-day vulnerabilities that occur, which I'm going to talk through an example of at the end of how we use use case management for this, and then retire those out and bring in new ones. So it's a constantly evolving life cycle, which really helps improve a client security posture. And we do all this using our Centre of Excellence. So within the business, we have a COE, as it's referred to, and these are the experts and subject matter experts who will be able to build out this these functions, whether it's use case management, whether looking at source, so secure orchestration and automated response playbooks as part of that use case management, adding in new data sources, so making sure we're collecting data from the right endpoints or right servers or users, and then writing out specific rules to work with those use cases. So for an example, if you're worried about a file being downloaded from somewhere, then making sure we've got a rule in place to detect that is being done. And we do all this again in an agile methodology, so it's constantly fast-paced, and we're working with our client base to make sure we're detecting threats where we need to. We're implementing automated responses to make sure that we're not relying on the human element as much, and that means the human element is then free to get involved in more low-level threats and improving security over time. And we can revisit all of these things continuously to make sure that they are working properly. So from a security operations center point of view, we work in sort of 4 areas that I like to break down as part of the overall life cycle of the security operations center, which is assessment, monitoring, collaboration, and defensive controls. So during the life cycle, we will start with an assessment. So we want to make sure that we know what we're trying to protect and where. So it goes back to the sort of crown jewels concept of, right, what is it in your business you're most worried about, and what do we want to protect? Do you need to instill any compliance management? Do you have any legal or regulatory requirements to protect data to a set standard? This is where we build in use case management to that, and then alert ranking. So we make sure that for each of our clients, that the alerts that they're receiving are more specific to them. Some people may be more worried about brute force attempts, which might be lower down in our alert ranking for another client. So it's always good to have those discussions and work out what is important to who. And looking at security refinement improvement, so looking where we can improve configurations of devices, services, servers, or even user training. And then root cause analysis, because unfortunately in the world of security, it's not an if it's going to happen, it's when it's going to happen. So making sure that if there are any security incidents, we are going back and understanding the root cause of why that's happened and how we prevent it happening in the future. Obviously, probably the biggest part of a security operations center is, and the security service is obviously the monitoring and what we need to monitor and what we need to collect. So that's where we look at what tools are what tools are best placed to monitor the infrastructure that you have. So whether it's on-prem, if it's in a private cloud, if you're using public clouds, should it's Azure, should we deploy Defender, should we deploy Sentinel, using VMware, should you use Carbon Black, etc. So really understanding your infrastructure and what tool is going to be best purposely served to protect you. And then looking at how we use that data in our security incident event management system. So feeding that data into a central platform, making sure that's correlated. So we have data being linked together from various sources, which will give you much more insight into whether or not an incident is currently occurring. And then deploying within those tools things like network visibility, so making sure you have a good overview of everything across your network, any new devices that are added or taken away, any new firewall changes that are made, so you're introducing access from somewhere else where you may not should be, and detecting abnormal behavior across your network and your user base. So these are all elements that we use on a monitoring perspective, and again, work through the life cycle to make sure that they are up to date, they're modern, and they are best placed to detect what we're trying to, and that they're deployed in all the right areas that they should be, and how we're actually facing that information to both our internal teams and to clients themselves to make sure that they're getting a visualization of what is going on across their infrastructure in the best manner. A large part, obviously, what we do is collaboration. So making sure that from an incident point of view, we are contacting the right people as customers, whether they're internal or external, whether they are third parties from a forensics point of view, or government organisations if we need to escalate incidents up to those, and as well as the customer, to make sure that if it is 4 in the morning that we have somebody to go to, or in the case that we have the knowledge that we do not need to notify anybody at 4 in the morning, we can deal with things ourselves. We work a lot with third-party penetration testing companies who we bake into the service, so making sure that during the life cycle of our security services that they're being tested externally. And that's not just a security element, obviously that's your application, your website, your infrastructure stack, making sure that those tests are done at an interval that is most appropriate to the risk of what we're testing, and then anything that comes out the back of that, we are then making sure we're working along with you with those results to make sure that they're patched and remediated. Part of what we do is work with third-party vendors and any software companies, so such as VMware or Microsoft, to get advanced notifications of vulnerabilities, so that we know if there's a vulnerability out there and we can get advanced notification of it before it's released to the general public. Then we can make sure that that's patched and remediated before it becomes public knowledge, so that when it does, any exploit attempts against that vulnerability will just be null and voided because you've already had that mitigation in place, which is great. And also utilizing threat intelligence feeds. So as a security operations center, we receive a lot of data every day, and all that data is made up of IP addresses, domains that are malicious. We can query, obviously we store that data for a long time, 12 months. So over that time period, we build up a massive picture of activity we've seen before by an IP address or a user, or sending information to a domain, which we query every single incoming IP address that may be doing an attack or maybe not doing an attack against those lists, to make sure we have a confidence rating that if that's been seen before, that we can then block it from doing whatever activity it's doing. So that's ourselves internally, but we work with feeds that are provided to us from the likes of like the NCSC and third parties such as Shodan.io. If anyone's ever used that, it's a great tool to use, but make sure that we're checking multiple feeds from multiple locations to make sure we're getting a good overview of what activity is being done by what source addresses and source malicious entities, perhaps. Obviously, a large part of what we do is implementing defensive controls. So I mentioned a few times, but SOAR, or Secure Orchestration Automated Response, is one of the biggest elements, and it's one of the most helpful tools that you can use. So from a sec DevOps point of view, looking at any alerts that are coming in and automating as much of the response as possible is the best way to go. It helps you relieve pressure on security analysts and engineers that are working within the stock and relieving alert fatigue to make sure that there's an automated response to almost every single action that's coming in, and then make sure that we're updating those as well. Obviously, implementing use case management is something we've discussed already, but that's a large part of the control set that we use as a SOC. Secure configuration, so making sure that we are constantly evaluating the configuration of a device, whether that's an operating system or it's an application, and making sure that that is then benchmarked against standards such as the CIS, so the CIS Centre for Internet Security publish guides on how to secure a configuration in the best way. What we'll do is run assessments against of our device configurations against those benchmarks on a regular basis to get a score out the other end, say, well, you might be 70% compliant against this standard, you need to do X, Y, and Z to get 30% more compliant. So implementing that on an ongoing basis allows you to stay protected and more from a human element as well, so avoiding mistakes that may be made. Threat hunting, we've mentioned, that's a large part of what we do. Searching for indicators of compromise, going back through and looking how an event or a series of events may lead to an incident and putting a stop to that. Incident playbooks, so making sure we've documented how we're going to respond to an incident and going through and testing those as well. Looking at how you remove a supplier, so this is more around if you're using a vendor whose software is you may be worried might be at risk, which is one of the attacks I'll talk through in a minute, but having a process in to remove that from your infrastructure, and then making sure you're looking at why am I using this tool, why am I using this software, is there more value supplied than the amount of risk that it may be introducing into your environment. 2 seconds. So that's an overview of the day-to-day running of all the areas that make up a security operations center from our perspective, and how we run through that life cycle to continually improve security and provide reassurance to our client base that we are doing so. And this is I'm just going to lead on now to how we've seen attacks evolving and the type of attacks we've seen over the past 5 to 6 years and how they're sort of changing. One of the biggest areas what we're seeing is a growth in the supply chain attack. So everything used to be on-prem, obviously in the olden days. Now everything's more going cloud-based, cloud-ready, which means there's a lot more third-party software potentially being used, more tools being used that integrate into software that from anywhere. That can be from legitimate companies who've been developing software for years. It can be open source projects, but they're all elements that have become part of the company's sort of supply chain. And that's where the attack surface is moving towards from our perspective, and that's where we're seeing the most growth. So when we look down a cyber attack kill chain, this is the elements that an entity will go through to try and compromise your infrastructure. So looking for a weakness is obviously the first stage. So looking for a vulnerability, then building a payload around that vulnerability to see how that's compromised. There's with most CVEs that are registered, which are vulnerabilities, there's a lot of easy to find instructions of how to then compromise that vulnerability. So searching for that vulnerability, then building something to exploit it is where I start. Sending a payload to then exploit that vulnerability and execute on the target. The next stages, which will give a malicious entity access to your infrastructure, which will then install a backdoor on, which will give them remote access or remote code execution. Once they've done that, then they have the ability to more than likely do this on a number of different devices around the world where they've exploited vulnerabilities in the same manner, which allows them to command and control all of those aspects at once, whether that is to do data exfiltration, ransomware encryption, use it as a botnet to do distributed denial of service. It's completely up to whatever they're trying to achieve, whether it's from a criminal point of view or just for sabotage. So they're the steps that an attacker will go through. And these are 3 areas that we've seen this happen for a lot. So web platform infiltration is where we've seen digital agencies be compromised from the point of view where they're building websites. They might be building plugins to use in your website if you're using like an e-commerce platform, for example, plugins to make a cart, we do as a malicious entity will compromise that element, which is then used in a number of legitimate business websites, which can then be activated to, instead of, for example, clicking a button, it's sending you to a legitimate site, it'll then send all of the people who click that to an illegitimate site or a malicious domain. Of drive-by attacks, where by compromising a legitimate server, they will deliver malware through that site, and then that malware will then be delivered on and installed onto the person surfing to that website. And then probably the biggest one that is happening more and more is through third-party software. So last year it was, I think, or the year before, with the SolarWinds compromise, where their software was compromised, and a backdoor was installed into that software, which that was used widely across all federal government in America. Lots of businesses used it, which introduced a lot of a pain for people, and that was distributed out, and nobody knew about it because they were downloading legitimate software to use, and it just had a backdoor and a remote code execution in it the whole time, which you need to be really ready for to try and respond to in the case of that, which is similar to what we saw and how we responded to the log4shell or log4j vulnerability that occurred in December. So this is to take through the path of what we did in response to that, and how that worked through use case management, and how we managed to get deployments out to our client base who we were protecting within first day or two, depending on how complex their solution was. But so if you've not heard of log4j, it was an open source Java module that's used for logging. There was a vulnerability that's published on the 9th of December as a 0 day. So nobody knew this was coming. It just got released into the wild, and it was being seen to be compromised very, very quickly. I think one of the things I've seen change over the past few years is the amount of time it's taking for vulnerabilities to be attempted to be exploited. It used to be a lot longer than it is now. So within the first day, we were seeing people try to exploit this, and from the diagram, you can see the exploit for anything externally facing. You can probe it with a specific string to see if that component was there and exploitable, and if it was, you could then get basically remote commode execution into a client's infrastructure. So from a use case perspective, what we needed to do is say, right, how we're going to prevent this from becoming a point of problem for our clients and leading to compromises. So right, we need to detect this vulnerability. So how we're going to do that? So there's several ways that we needed to do that. You could either try and test an externally facing server with that specific string, and that would tell you if that component was on there and compromisable. We have a variety of tools that we use across our client base. For Azure, we use obviously Sentinel Defender, which is amazing, and as a central point of control and a seam to push out to all of your endpoints. It's really, really helpful to use and orchestrate responses on a level of like this. So we knew that we could use our tool sets to collect the correct data, which we'd need. So any logs basically that would help us see if this exploit had already been attempted, and if it had, then we could focus on seeing if that exploit had been then further gone through a client's infrastructure through lateral movement, or looking at software versions and files to see if the log4j component was installed on that element of the infrastructure. And the data source that we needed to do that, to get that data, was the following. So we knew we needed to connect into devices and connect into those components to collect that data to discover that. So once we've done that, we need to write a load of detection rules. So say, okay, we need to go out to these devices to detect if this exploit is there, if this component is there, and if it's exploitable. So writing a load of queries, markmanship KQL is a great querying language that you can write, which will go out and discover if this component was on any endpoint, which is great. So writing each of those writing all of those rules dependent on what operating system, what device people are using, doesn't matter, we wrote them all for every single device, and then pushing that detection rule out to all the endpoints that we're monitoring. So then once you've done that, then you run the detection rule on your endpoint, and that'll scan through and look if those files, if that component was there, the version of that that component, see if it was the vulnerable version, and then that would report back into our security operations center. So we'd have a big list for each client of whether that vulnerability is present and on what device. And then what we do is remediation and mitigation. So there's 3 ways that we could defend against this. There's upgrade outdate packages, disabling the package at the time, which eventually was found out that that didn't actually fix it. So, but that was the first thought. So you could either disable it, or what we ended up doing with the majority of them is just flat out deleting that component, because if we couldn't upgrade it because it was part of another piece of software by another vendor, then the easiest answer is to just get rid of it. So once we've written that sort of script once to do that, which is the sort of top time there, so is to get vulnerability incoming, look through where it's happened before, if it's present on any client device. Then once it is, decide if that is actually true, then add that item to your block list, sinkhole, destroy it, delete it, update it, whatever. Write all that into automation, then you can push that out across thousands, hundreds of thousands of devices as quickly as you possibly can to make sure that they're all immediately patched and not vulnerable anymore. Before using the automation, automated response, and orchestration to do this, you'd have to do all this manually. So if you think it takes almost up to an hour or even longer per endpoint to do it all manually, for an environment where you're monitoring thousands of devices, you'd be doing it for ages and ages. But luckily, through using like secure DevOps, we could automate this process, which allowed us to push out our fixes for this in a really speedy way. That was me. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, so thanks, Stephen, for that. I think, yeah, useful just to have a look. I mean, I spoke more about strategic stuff that we would do in the platform, but moving on to more what the SOC does, and the reason the SOC is there, and how we use modern technology for diagnosing or getting exploits, and then pushing them exploits out using automation and SOAR and things like that. So we want to give you a flavour of strategic but also operational things that you do in the SOC, and why we built the SOC the way we built it. So this is some way that we can obviously help you. Obviously reach out to your account manager, or even if you've got a Microsoft AE as well, reach out to those guys. We're happy to come and have a conversation, talk around what your strategy is, where you are now, where you want to be going, how you want to before you get there. But also, if you're interested in the MDR service, which we know a lot of our customers are starting to move towards, it's co-managed, it's blended, we use RACI, for instance, to make sure that we only control the factors that we need to control within that environment to give the best. If we need to remediate, we can do. If you want just to detect and alert, then we can do that as well. So this is what we find the customers are finding really useful, is to be able to be an extension of their team to be able to deliver an MDR service. If any other stuff that we want to be able to do, so go and deploy Microsoft Sentinel as part of an MDR service, we can go and do that. There's also some funding where I think one of 4 MSSPs within the UK that has got the access to that funding. So we can certainly support you in doing something that's probably going to be cost neutral. And then obviously the SecOps Navigator is around very strategic approach. We'll look at where you are now, what your aspirations and your objectives, build a target architecture, and then obviously what we do after that is build a transition plan to go between that and the target architecture, and then the business case that will wrap that. And then the Sentinel and Defender accelerators is just for us to be able to go out and deploy Sentinel and Defender, so you can touch and feel it, get a feel what the technology, can you get used to using that within your environment. So that's pretty much what that one is. Probably the first thing what I need to really thank everybody is thank every time, 90 minutes of people's time to come and listen to what we've got to say. Really do appreciate that. I know it's hard to get time out from a busy schedule. I think everybody on the call is very, very busy. So again, thanks for your time, and thanks to Stephen as well as co-presenter as well. Much appreciated. So I hope you have a good rest of your evening and weekend, and hopefully we'll hear. Yes, we'll share the presentation. The guys will reach out, and obviously you'll get a copy of that of the recording as well. So I really do appreciate everybody's time, and have a good day.